Okay, so probably a significant class of receptor tyrosine kinases are those in which there are three distinct domains. Okay, the first domain is the hormone binding domain, and then the transmembrane domain, and finally the tyrosine kinase domain. Okay, so we call these RTKs since they're both receptors and they are tyrosine kinases. Okay, so some examples of that is the insulin receptor. The epidermal growth factor receptor. Platelet-derived growth factor receptor. Probably the fibroblast growth factor receptor. Okay, a bunch of growth factor receptors that would stimulate cell division or some other, usually cell division, except nerve growth factor, which is way different. Okay, so we'll take a look at the receptor tyrosine kinase and some of the pathways that they can elicit, certainly not all of the pathways. Okay? Sometimes, and we sort of mentioned this already, a receptor has just the receptor binding domain or the ligand binding domain and the transmembrane domain, but no receptor, or no tyrosine kinase. Okay, so no tyrosine kinase. So it has to recruit a tyrosine kinase. Okay, which is this. Sometimes, in some set of receptors, the tyrosine kinase SRC will land on at least the cytoplasmic domain of the receptor. Okay, and SRC, I think, was the first tyrosine kinase ever discovered. It was actually first discovered in a virus, and then, lo and behold, it was discovered that, oh my gosh, we've got the same gene. Okay. So this is the SRC family. I think we probably don't have any good examples. We're not going to cover that because they're so specific. But we will cover another receptor that just is a receptor, a transmembrane domain, and then a brief cytoplasmic domain. And the tyrosine kinase that binds to this kind of receptor is JAK. So don't get mixed up with J and K, this is JAK. And JAK's main job is to activate the transcription factor STAT. Okay? So this is the JAK-STAT pathway, better known as the JAK-STAT pathway. We'll look at a couple of, hopefully, get through some examples of a JAK-STAT pathway. So there's, oh no, this is the SRC family. Okay. In general, cytokines bind to the JAK-STAT type receptors. So things that would stimulate the immune system or some activation of an immune cell. So typical ligands up here could include interleukins, interferon, and erythropoietin. I don't know how to spell it. Okay, let's just call it euro. I have no idea how to spell it. Okay, we'll take a look at hopefully the JAK-STAT pathway, and the activation of the transcription factor STAT. Okay, so that's the three classes of receptors that are associated with tyrosine kinase activity. Okay, we're going to cover receptor tyrosine kinases first, and then we'll end with the JAK-STAT pathway. And whatever happens with the JAK-STAT pathway, you can imagine is going to happen to SARC. Okay. Well, you sort of know how to activate receptor tyrosine kinases because it's been a pattern that we've seen before and we're going to continue to see again and again. Activation usually requires the dimerization, well, it always requires that the receptor is dimerized. It turns out that the insulin receptor is always dimerized whether or not insulin is bound, but the binding of the insulin activates the tyrosine kinase activity. But usually, the typical behavior is that the ligand dimerizes the two receptor tyrosine kinases, and they autotransphosphorylate. And of course, they autotransphosphorylate on tyrosine receptors. Okay, so that we've talked about this really with the insulin receptor, is that marks an active receptor complex. So we saw that even when there's receptor downregulation in the presence of ER stress, the remaining receptors do happen to be phosphorylated on tyrosines. Okay, so the phosphates, these phosphates serve two functions. Okay, and I am going to, I'll put the two functions there, and then I'm going to rinse these guys and take a look at the big picture. So dimerization will lead to a little bit of activity of tyrosine kinase, but once some of those phosphates or the tyrosines near the active site are phosphorylated, we get enhanced tyrosine kinase. Okay, and the other function of the phosphates is, you sort of already know, it is, they do provide docking sites for particular proteins. Okay, we saw that with IRE. Remember, TRAC happened to be able to dock onto a phosphorylated IRE. IRS, we noticed, it docks onto the insulin receptor at a particular phosphorylated tyrosine. I think I'm going to come back to it. One of the things I will probably come back to is, because these have some extracellular domain to them, a lot of cancer-specific drugs are being targeted to receptor tyrosine kinases. Because a lot of times, a receptor tyrosine kinase is overexpressed in a cancer cell. There's too much of the receptor on the cell surface, and they can occasionally bump into each other. So you get like almost constitutive activation. Oh, let's do it. Okay. So the first drug I ever heard of, in fact, it was one of the very first drugs that was sort of cancer specific, was the drug Herceptin. Anybody ever heard of that drug? It was developed probably came out on the market in the 90s. And I remember seeing, and a whole bunch of movie actors got involved in the development of this particular drug and marketing this particular drug. It's a monoclonal antibody. So it binds very specifically to the HER receptor, okay, which is a receptor tyrosine kinase overexpressed on some cancer cells. If you have a HER-positive cancer cell, that means that there's overexpression of that receptor. Okay? So the antibody binds to the receptor, and that usually leads to receptor downregulation. It's sometimes, the antibody bound to the receptor sometimes attracts cytotoxic T cells to kill the cancer cell, which probably doesn't always work because sometimes some of the cytotoxic T signals are, please commit apoptosis, but cancer cells are resistant to apoptosis. Let's see. There's another drug used in cancer, in lung cancer cells, Iressa. Lung cancer cells, which is also an inhibitor of tyrosine kinases, and it happens to be the epidermal growth factor receptor. And then there's another one called Gleevec, and which was the first truly tumor-specific drug. And I'm going to cover Gleevec later. And if I don't cover Gleevec, remind me. Treats chronic myelogenous leukemia. And if I don't get to it, please tell me. So, because I want to talk about how it is cancer specific. Okay, so and there's probably a lot more receptor tyrosine kinase drugs out there on the market because so many cancers overexpress a receptor tyrosine kinase. And you don't have to worry about does the drug, do we have to get the drug into the cell? Do you suppose you can take Herceptin orally? It's an antibody. No, you can't take it orally because it's a hormone, or it's an antibody, it's a protein, and your digestive system would break it down to amino acids, so Herceptin has to be injected, just like insulin is needed.
How does the antibody in, like, breast milk get to the baby?
How does the antibody cause the receptor?
I mean, like when babies breastfeeding, some of them that get antibody from the mother.
Oh, that's requires receptor-mediated endocytosis. So the antibody that's found in the mother's blood is endocytosed into a mammary gland cell, and then it's exocytosed on the other side of the cell into the mother's milk.
I mean, when the baby drinks the milk, do they get the antibody?
Yeah. Oh, yes. There is a reverse process that can happen in the mother. Or in the baby, where there is an ability for the baby to endocytose the antibody. I don't know. I don't think that works well enough for a drug like this to be effective. I've seen that. This drug has been delivered by IV or usually IV.
So wouldn't that be like an oral intake of antibody?
So what?
Wouldn't that be an oral intake of antibody from the mother to the child through breastfeeding?
Yeah, that would be. Yeah, what you're describing would certainly be that. Actually, that's a good question, Suleiman, is what is happening? If a baby can do it, how come that? And my hunch is it's probably the dose required. Okay, so we're going to put a whole bunch of tyrosines on and look at some of the proteins that can bind to receptor tyrosine kinases, because it's a huge, huge list, and we're not covering everything. Okay, and we'll start out with the one that you know. IRS, okay, the insulin receptor substrate, which is going to pick up phosphorylations, tyrosine phosphorylations from the receptor tyrosine kinase to add to the population of phosphate groups that are used as docking sites. IRS and any of the proteins that I'm going to mention don't randomly bind to a phosphorylated tyrosine because they're also reading the amino acids on either side of that phosphorylated tyrosine. So it's not a random, whatever there's a phosphorylated tyrosine, this guy can just dock onto anything. It's not. It is actually looking for the phosphate plus the amino acids flanking that tyrosine. Okay? So we were looking at the fact that all of the proteins I'm going to mention have a docking site that binds specifically to a phosphorylated tyrosine. This docking site is called the SH2 domain. Okay, so in molecular genetics, I think we've just recently covered a bromodomain, a chromodomain, and a chromoshadow domain. Okay, just to add to this, you guys, here's another one, an SH2 domain, which allows a protein to bind to a phosphorylated tyrosine. Okay, so just to be clear, the phosphorylated tyrosine is not the SH2 domain. The binding site on IRS is the SH2 domain. Okay, it stands for Sark homology because that's so that binding domain was discovered first on the tyrosine kinase Sark. Okay, so that's one. Let's see. Well, we've already mentioned, so I might as well bring it up again. I'm just going to try to give you proteins different shapes, so you know they're not the same protein. Oh, hi guys. Hi. Were you down in lab?
Yeah.
Oh, I think I saw you guys this earlier. All right. Okay. Phospholipase C gamma. Okay. Phospholipase C gamma does exactly the same thing as phospholipase C beta. So it's going to create the two second messenger diacylglycerol and IP3. But notice how phospholipase C gamma docks the phospholipase A close to the cell surface where the inositol phosphatidylinositol diphosphate is located. Okay, so there's a protein that has an SH2 domain. Okay, it cannot interact with a G protein. It interacts with a phosphorylated receptor tyrosine kinase. Okay, so you know that one. Oh, here's another one that you would know. And I'm just going to be really, instead of giving it the real name, I'm going to do that. A GAP, a GTPase activating protein. And this is going to be the gap for the protein RAS. Okay, and there's other gaps can be recruited to a receptor tyrosine kinase, but we're gonna specifically talk about the gap that can activate REST. Or activate the GTPase activities of REST. Okay, another one. Oh, we're gonna spend lots of time talking about this one. Okay, big worms. Okay. PI3K. PI3K is phosphatidyl inositol 3 kinase. Okay, its job is to create the second messenger, phosphatidyl inositol 3 kinase, or PIP3. Notice it's different from IP3. This is PIP3. And in my notes, and I was gleaning through notes because my notebook is getting way too full with old and new notes. I would have to very carefully explain the difference, but you will see the difference later. We're going to spend quite a bit of time on that PI3 kinase, because it is vicious. Actually, it's downstream proteins that are more vicious. Okay, and then finally, we could put down, oh no, I still have another one. Oh, ran out of phosphates. Okay. Stats combined. Okay, this happens to be, if this happens to be a JAK-STAT type pathway, stats don't bind to receptor tyrosine kinases, but they do bind to phosphorylated tyrosines when the protein is JAK. No, actually they do bind to the receptor. I take that back. So I could put it there.
Dr. Singer, would PKC have the same way that PLC does? Does it also have the SH2 domain?
Yeah, everything I'm listing here has an SH2 domain.
Would PKC
Yeah.
as well?
So phospholipase C gamma has an SH2 domain, but phospholipase C beta does not.
Okay.
Okay? So instead, phospholipase C beta has a binding site for the alpha Q subunit of the G protein. Okay. So there's another one, thinking of, gee, significant similarity, significant difference. There's lots of protein options here for significant similarity. Significant difference. Okay. So there's one class of proteins that has an SH2 domain. And the one we're going to look at is called GRB2. Okay? But it has some other docking site that's not a phosphorylated tyrosine. Okay, so that little box, that little notch is another docking site. So not all proteins that have to be brought up to the cell surface have capacity to bind to a phosphorylated tyrosine. So this protein is an adapter. It can bind to the phosphorylated tyrosine to provide a different kind of binding site. Okay, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. Okay, so we got adapters that create other types of docking sites. Okay, so to summarize, we look at all of the proteins with SH2 domains. And we notice that some of them are enzymes whose substrates are at the cell surface. Enzymes whose substrates are at the cell surface. Okay, phospholipase C gamma is an example where the substrate is a protein, a phospholipid in the cell plasma membrane, PI3 kinase. And you'll notice, and I'll let you notice this later, the substrates for both of these enzymes, PLC and phosphatidylinositol 3 kinase, same substrate. But the products are going to be different. Okay, same substrate. Okay, we also saw the, I think that's it. GAPA, I would not call GAPA an enzyme. Okay, we've seen adapters that provide additional docking sites. So let's see, so we got IRS, here's one, GRB2, and there's lots of proteins similar to GRB2. So you might see similar proteins that have similar functions in your papers, but they're called, have some other name. And of course, transcription factors. And I really don't know any transcription factors other than STATs. Okay, so that's how receptor tyrosine kinases kind of work. All they really provide nothing more. Well, sometimes they phosphorylate. I think PLC is activated by pulling it up to the cell membrane where the substrate is, and it also has to be phosphorylated. Okay, so some of these proteins require phosphorylation, IRS. In order to be a docking site, it has to be phosphorylated. I don't know about PI3 kinase, whether it is just pulled up to the membrane to be close, or whether it has to be phosphorylated.
Where is GAP on the?
You know, I don't have a place for GAP. I don't know where to put it because it's not an enzyme. It's really not an adapter. It's sort of a, I don't know what category to put it in.
Could that be a substrate?
Huh?
I mean, could that be a substrate?
No, let's see, it's not a substrate. I don't know what to call it. Regulatory protein, I don't know. It's sort of in a category off by itself, so I'm kind of clueless. I would have put it someplace, but it falls under none of those categories. Okay, so the receptor tyrosine kinase is almost exclusively just a place for the real guys to dock. So it's the real guys that are going to carry out the signal transduction. Okay, so we are going to do the most well-known and well-studied of all of the signal transduction pathways activated by receptor tyrosine kinases, and that's the RAS-MAP kinase pathway. Probably the most overactive pathway in cancer. Look at all of the cancers to see which pathways are overactive. Almost always it's the RAS-MAP kinase. And you'll notice that neither RAS is a protein that's prenylated, it's found in the cell membrane, but none of these proteins I listed are RAS or a MAP kinase. Okay, so we have to move from one of these proteins to the activation of RAS and the activation of tyrosine kinase. Okay. All of these the RAS-MAP kinase pathways are usually activated by a growth factor. Like platelet-derived growth factor or epidermal growth factor. Okay, so MAP stands for mitogen activated protein kinase. Okay, so the mitogen is something that stimulates mitosis. Okay. The mitogen in this case is the growth factor. So the growth factor tells the cell to divide. And so we're going to kind of, we want to set some context for the story that we're going to, you can pretend that you cut your finger, you've all done that, paper cut, whatever. A slip of a knife, or like, oops. And you break open or cut into a blood vessel. That creates a jagged edge on the blood vessel, unless you do a really clean cut, which scalpels can do. But that jagged edge attracts a whole bunch of platelets. Okay, platelets love sticky edges. Or they like some collagen that may have gotten into the blood vessel because of the cut. And platelets, once they're activated, will secrete platelet-derived growth factor. Okay, so that's what we're going to be thinking about. So our growth factor is going to be platelet-derived growth factor. Platelets secrete a whole lot of things, other types of things that are going to attract, more platelets and activate more platelets. One of the things, by the way, that platelets also secrete are prostaglandins. Well, they're thromboxanes, which are modified prostaglandins. And the thromboxanes activate more platelets and attract more platelets to the site in order to produce a blood clot. So it's really the platelet function to produce blood clots. NSAIDs, non-steroid anti-inflammatory drugs, like aspirin and ibuprofen and Tylenol, block the synthesis of thromboxanes. So if you've ever had some sort of surgery, one of the things they tell you is in the days before the surgery, you can't take any aspirin and you can't take any ibuprofen. Ibuprofen's a pretty decent inhibitor of thromboxane synthesis. Has anybody ever had that kind of information? Don't take aspirin, don't take